You certainly can't go back in time and change maybe what has happened to you, but that's sort of the benefits of an existential approach to mental health, especially for veterans, is it's not about what's happened in the past. It's about how we can make choices now by first identifying where we want to be in the future as a means of navigating wellness and whatever that looks like for each individual.
When a civilian enters any branch of the military, they go through a period of basic military training that's designed to change the way they think and act to turn them into a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, or Coast Guardsman.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
This is seen as an important time in the individual's life, critical for the proper transition from being someone not in the military to part of one of the greatest fighting forces on the planet.
Earn my pay. Hard work, hard work, do it every day. Hard work, get up out of 2:45. Hard work.
After a period of time in the military, however, there's little done in any branch of the service to help that service member transition their mindset to life as a veteran.
Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work.
As we often say here in the Change Your POV podcast network, after one leaves the military, they're never going to be a civilian again. And they're no longer a service member. They're this entirely different third thing, a veteran, with all the experiences, knowledge, strengths, and challenges that go along with that word.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
One of the most overlooked aspects of transition is a service member's mental health and wellness. If the veteran has their heart, mind, body, and spirit in the right place, and has a support network of family and friends to rely upon, then they're most likely going to have a successful transition. If those things are not in place, things can get challenging.
Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, that's what they say.
I'm your host, Dwayne France, and I'm going to take you through a veteran mental health boot camp to give you some advanced training for your brain.
Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, sit them on down. Hard work.
These episodes will cover the many different aspects of veteran mental health that I, as both a combat veteran and a clinical mental health counselor, see, experience, and support veterans with daily.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, hard work.
I'm going to be joined by both veterans and mental health professionals talking about what you need to know about the stigma against seeking support, the different areas we need to understand, and provide some resources for when you think you might need them.
That's what I say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
Get up in the morning and out of the rack, because this is some information that could very well save your life. Welcome to Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp.
Another day's of work. Hard work, that's what they say.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing Podcast. Once again, my name's Dwayne France and I'm your host. I really appreciate you taking the time to not only to listen to this particular show, but stick with us as we're going through this series of veteran mental health, which goes beyond just PTSD and TBI. So if you're keeping score, we're halfway through. You're on the 7th interview so far. We've covered internal stigma, external stigma against help seeking. We have talked about PTSD and TBI because those are actually aspects of veteran mental health, but really there's more than that. And then we talked about substance abuse and emotion regulation. And so now we're getting into sort of those aspects of veteran mental health that, as I described in the first episode, that you can go back and listen to episode 25, that really aren't diagnosable conditions necessarily. So the second half are really mental health concerns that veterans deal with that maybe aren't diagnosable but are still major aspects to it. So again, appreciate you listening, again, not just to this show but to the series overall. So I'd like to introduce to today's guest, Dr. Aaron Smith. And Dr. Smith and I have had a couple of conversations about some really great stuff, and I think we're going to have to rein it in because both he and I are pretty geeked up on this kind of topic. But Aaron, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dwayne, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here. And you're absolutely right. This is an exciting topic. And so you may have to do the reining.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of us are probably going to have to make sure that curb our enthusiasm, I guess. And so before we get into that, before we get into the purpose and meaning and the existential aspect of it, how about you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your military service, and then sort of what you did after you got out?
Yeah. So initially, I joined the United States Marine Corps back in 2005, right out of high school. I was not sure whether or not college was something that I wanted. So I ended up with Delta Company 4th Reconnaissance Battalion as an infantry Marine, as an 0311. So I was with Delta from 2005 through 2013. In 2008, we had a short deployment to the island of Curacao with the Royal Dutch Marines, which was essentially a training mission to help train Royal Dutch Marines on how to conduct reconnaissance operations. So yeah, that's kind of my military service in a nutshell, if you will.
So you were in for how long?
8 years.
Okay, so you had 8 years, but then you got out and you weren't a mental health professional when you were in the Marine Corps.
That's
how
right.
did you get into working as a mental health professional?
Yeah, great question. So when I joined my unit in 2007, they were essentially in a position where they had been over-deployed. And so they had been deployed so many times since 2001 that there was this decision made that any further deployments would have to be rigorously vetted. And so that's why we ended up on our deployment to South America. As a result of being in a unit, especially one like a reconnaissance unit, I realized early on how important it was to learn about how to work with survivors of trauma, how to talk about issues like suicide, which was something that affected our unit in a very real way across the entirety of those 8 years. And I realized that I had very few of those types of skills. So even as an NCO, I mean, going through a lot of the trainings that they require you to go through on, say, counseling Marines, it's typically in counseling in terms of the pro cons, right? As opposed to maybe counseling your junior Marines, especially about the things that they do to take care of themselves, which I found to actually be one of the more important pieces of leadership, of small unit leadership in the Marines, but one that we didn't talk about very often. So for me, that was definitely where my interest in psychology came into play. I'd come across, and this is maybe a little bit preemptive for what we're going to be talking about here in a bit, but I'd come across Man's Search for Meaning when I was in School of Infantry. We had actually had a Marine who had attempted suicide. It was pretty gruesome. So finding that book during that time of my life ended up being a really powerful sort of formative experience for me in terms of how to make sense of what was going on. And helping other people make sense of what was going on as well. And so sure enough, when I got out of the Marines, I decided to pursue a degree in psychology. From psychology, I fell in love with the applied aspects of working with veterans in a therapy role, or a more therapeutic role, as opposed to a role as a researcher. So then from there, I went ahead and applied to the University of New Mexico's Counselor Ed program, worked through my master's and became licensed in working with veterans in a mental health capacity. My interest continued to grow, though, as I came across a number of questions that weren't being answered and weren't even being posed in the research on how to work with veterans and how to help facilitate greater veteran mental wellness. So one thing that you and I talked to in our initial conversation actually was about how little you find conversations about meaning and purpose as a core aspect or core element of what wellness looks like, especially for veterans. And so I decided to pursue the PhD to kind of learn how to approach those questions from a more structured sort of scientific approach than what I had the skills to do at the time. Does that make sense?
No, it does, absolutely. And as I'm listening to you, my one of my fellow co-hosts, Bennett Tanton, who is also a former Marine, served some time in the Army, but he said he was a Marine that wore Army clothes. But
there you go.
But you kind of broke the mold and sort of going against the stereotype of the uneducated Marine, so to speak. I mean, and obviously, that's stereotypes that everybody plays into and things like that. But a lot of the things that you're talking about, and even finding, like you said, Man's Search for Meaning at the beginning, you're right. There is a lack of conversation, which is why we're trying to do this series not necessarily a lack of conversation with the veterans themselves, but there's a lack of a conversation in our professional community about veteran mental health when it comes to existentialism. So can you talk to us a little bit about what existential psychology is, maybe as from the broad spectrum?
Yeah, most definitely. So I don't want to go too far back. I mean, I could go all the way back to the existential philosophies that help to inform how we use existential psychology in a mental health capacity. But essentially, I mean, for thousands of years, we've been thinking about what makes life meaningful, or maybe not so meaningful, depending on your perspective. More specifically, the type of existential psychology that I'm working with or using in my research and in my clinical work with veterans is an existential psychology called Logotherapy, which was developed by Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. Definitely one of the fathers of existential thought. He's also a survivor of a concentration camp. And so when you talk about a field or a sect of psychology that is concerned about issues around death and dying and how death and dying can actually help you orient your actions and choices and attitudes now in as much as they're able to teach you how to live your life. You can imagine that a survivor of the Holocaust would be, particularly one as insightful as Viktor Frankl, might be a huge asset in trying to understand how a realization that time is finite can actually help you live a more well existence, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I like how you touched on sort of the very beginning, the philosophical underpinnings. This is something that obviously isn't widely known, is that the father of American psychology, so to speak, William James, was a philosopher by training. And so philosophy informed, like you said, just a lot of psychology from the very beginning. And maybe a sense of frustration is as we've gotten farther away from the philosophical understandings of mental health and more to the manualized sort of step-by-step approaches that we get farther away from our roots. So I like how you brought that, but then and you talk about Man's Search for Meaning, and I'll tell you, for those of you veterans, if you haven't read this book, it's not a very long book, and unless you're geeked up about mental health like Aaron and I are, you really only need to read the first half of the book. But the book, you need to go out, check it out. You need to listen to it. You need to read it. Aaron, when I first read that book, it was after my first tour in Iraq and in my second tour in Afghanistan, I think, when I finally read it. Yeah. So I was reading it from a combat veteran perspective, and I was surprised how many parallels there were, how many things I recognized in what he was saying about the concentration camps that I recognized in myself or those combat veterans that I've served. Is that something that you've heard from veterans?
Yeah, most definitely. So in particular, when we talk about serving in the military, one thing that I think is misconstrued by those who haven't served in the military is this idea that, why don't you just quit if you don't like it? Or why don't you just quit if your job is triggering for you or causing stressors that impact your life in a very real way? And we know that that's obviously not the case in the military. You can't just quit that job. And there's a deeper sense of why you wouldn't. Not only is there the administrative aspect of it, but you tend to have this deep sort of connection with other people in your unit that make that not a choice, right? And so most definitely when you talk about being stuck, say in a situation in the military, it is sort of similar in many ways to being a prisoner, but you're also very much a prisoner of your past experiences. And so you certainly can't go back in time and change maybe what has happened to you, but that's sort of the benefits of an existential approach to mental health, especially for veterans, is it's not about what's happened in the past. It's about how we can make choices now by first identifying where we want to be in the future as a means of navigating wellness and whatever that looks like for each individual.
Yeah, and I think that is critical, looking at that. And you talked earlier about looking at death and dying. But one thing that I always thought that Frankl did well was by looking at death and dying, we were able to also look at life and living.
Yeah.
And having, even in the most dire of circumstances where he was, still found life worth living, even in, horrible conditions.
Yeah.
So can you maybe talk a little bit about sort of Frankl's idea, his maybe the concepts, some of the stuff that he talked about in Man's Search for Meaning that you see a parallel with veterans?
Yeah, most definitely. That's a great question. So first off, he has these three sort of core tenets of logotherapy. They are freedom of will, will to freedom, and meaning in life. And so essentially meaning in life is the idea that meaning and purpose can be found under essentially all conditions. Regardless of what it is that might be going on, you can either discover meaning or you can create it. And as a mental health professional, you would not tell a client that most likely, right? Because it's easier said than done, especially when a trauma has been very recent. But it is important to recognize that first fact. The second would be freedom of will, which is the idea that you have some control over your actions or thoughts, in as much as they may help to adjust the course that you're on, either towards wellness or away from it. So what do we got? We have meaning in life, freedom of will, and will to meaning. So will to meaning is this idea that the basic human motivation is the search for meaning. And so Freud liked to talk about how sex or pleasure were the basic human motivation. A little bit later, one of his students, Adler, talked about how power was something that motivates every human being. And then Frankl came across, actually as a student of sort of Adler and a little bit of Freud, and said, no, I disagree with both of you. I think it's meaning. And so you might find meaning in power, or you might find meaning in pleasure. So those things can be true, but there's more nuance there, right? So when you talk about a veteran, somebody who has been in the military for any amount of time, really, you get pretty used to being told where to be, when to be there, who needs to be there, being told exactly what it is your meaning and purpose is at any given day or moment throughout your day, right? But when you get out of the military, a big part of that transition is you no longer have that. You no longer have somebody telling you where to be, when to be there, etc. And so on a deeper level, you also don't necessarily have somebody telling you what your meaning and purpose is going to be for that day or for that mission, whatever that might be before that operation. So I think maybe sort of in a general sense, that's how I typically introduce this idea when working with veterans, either in a clinical capacity or in a research one.
So, and I really like how you identified that will to meaning. Sometimes that when we were in the military, that meaning was provided for us.
Yeah.
But I also recognize that we established our own meaning for things. For example, I was deployed to Bosnia in the mid '90s, and for whatever reason we were there. I sort of made my own meaning to say that now these kids can play, and
yeah, I love it.
My meaning is that I'm there to keep that that stuff from happening. And I've heard guys say the same thing about Iraq and Afghanistan, whatever the big global national goals were, that they had the meaning was to be able to let this market go, or even was they made the meaning for themselves. When something was not able to be understood by them, they created a sort of meaning.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was surrounded by their friends, brothers and sisters in arms, and if nothing else, I need to continue because being a part of this gives me meaning. And so, although that, yes, we're told, do get up at the crack of dawn because I told you to, there's a bit of transformational aspect that you get up at the crack of dawn sort of because you want to. And so we can develop meaning. And this goes into, Frankl's other, meaning or happiness must ensue from something and it can't be pursued. That we develop that in ourselves in the military, but sometimes, again, in my experience, veterans forget how to find meaning in something that's meaningless outside the military. Right?
Yeah, no question at all. And I just want to say I really love that idea of looking at the nuances of meaning development throughout your time in the military. So I'm thinking of situations where even down the line, providing meaning to situations that may not have had meaning for you in that moment. So looking back on field operations that ended up being, in that moment, a really crappy field operation, right, where you're stuck out in the rain and the muck for a week or two at a time or a month, whatever. But looking back on it, those are the ones that I maybe look back on most fondly, which is kind of strange.
Retroactive meaning, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But you're right. It also does force you to kind of either discover or create a meaning in those situations where you're not given opportunities to have control over your schedule for that day. So yeah, most definitely. I love that approach. That makes a lot of sense to me, Dwayne.
So now, and you say that there is a lack of a conversation about it, sort of in a mental health sense or in a therapeutic sense.
Yeah.
But veterans talk about it all the time. They talk about it on Task and Purpose, and they talk about it on social media, right? This whole idea of, where am I? Who am I? What do I do with my life? These are questions of existence, and not questions of sort of, it's definitely not PTSD or anything like that.
No.
And so how do you help veterans understand that this is a totally different aspect of veteran mental health than just PTSD or TBI?
Yeah, so are we thinking more of the existential stuff or the post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and definitely getting into post-traumatic growth in a bit, but I guess from a therapeutic sense, it's not, we're not sitting here, staring at the sky or looking at our belly button, but we're really trying to understand, make meaning of our current existence and then our past existence. How do you help veterans work with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of it happens organically. And so one of the things that I teach counseling students who want to use an existential approach, and one thing that I was taught early on was that for you to be an effective advocate or fellow sufferer on that road, however you want to look at your role in that therapeutic alliance, you have to kind of know how to be directive, but also non-directive. It's kind of how to walk that line, because at the same time, or on the one hand, you might hear a veteran talking about something that makes them happy, and you see their face light up or their nonverbals change, and that might be a cue to you that they're talking about something that seems meaningful or was meaningful or whatever. But on the other hand, if you kind of key into that too much, you might be pushing something that you feel might be meaningful for that person when it might not actually be. And so it actually starts with Socratic dialogue. So Socrates came up with this approach to mental health. He called it maieutic dialogue, which is Greek for midwife. So literally what his idea was that you already have the knowledge to heal. And in this case, knowledge we're referring to is existential knowledge, what will or could make your life feel or be more meaningful. But what Socrates talked about was asking questions that are intentional. They're strategically designed questions to help you think for yourself about what things in your life might be meaningful or how past experiences might become meaningful, in as much as they help to guide you towards some greater purpose. And so one thing I like to do is ask them a question, and this definitely takes quite a bit of rapport I built with the individual that you're using this technique with, but asking them to talk about their life legacy. So how do you want to be remembered in this world when you're no longer around? The things you want to be most excited about, the things you maybe wouldn't be so excited about being remembered for, and then figuring out then, once you have an idea of the type of legacy that you want to leave this world, how each individual situational meaning between now and whenever that endpoint is, how that endpoint helps to inform or guide those situational meanings or decisions. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and it's sort of how I kind of help veterans. And I said, I want to help you realize what you already know.
Yeah.
Right? I want to, and we may not know it. The veteran may not know it, or whoever I'm working with may not be aware that this one thing is the thing that brings them, joy or brings them meaning or anything like that. And so, and that's really it, is helping them and reflecting and things like that. Another thing you said, though, was that we have the tools. This is one thing that I really would like for those mental health providers who are listening to this, is that we all know existential psychology. You know, I would say a good portion of mental health professionals working for a period of time talk a lot about this. Of course, Viktor Frankl and Irvin Yalom and Rollo May, and that in a very humanistic sort of psychology, but they don't know that they have these skills, and they don't realize that the veteran has these challenges, and therefore help them apply those skills to those challenges. What I mean is, if most practitioners believe that just PTSD and TBI are the end-all be-all when it comes to veteran mental health, then they're not going to address these existential concerns.
You're right. Well, it would even help for them to understand that those are aspects of post-traumatic stress, and certainly TBI can affect how you find meaning or purpose in life, or what becomes meaningful for you in the aftermath of a traumatic brain injury. But even looking at how trauma affects meaning, and meaning as an indicator of post-traumatic stress, that one that we don't oftentimes talk about, right? We talk about other indicators of post-traumatic stress, like intrusive recollections, autonomic nervous system hyperactivity, right? Things that are certainly important aspects of post-traumatic stress, but they don't necessarily hit on those deeper things, like you mentioned, things like meaning and purpose, and how those things are affected by trauma.
And I think that without really an understanding of how that aspect of just psychology or of mental health and wellness can impact PTSD, then I think a lot of veterans, in my experience, miss out on post-traumatic growth. And you'd mentioned that a little bit before. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth. I understand, what it is and its possibility, but I'd like you to break it down to the audience a little bit.
Yeah. What great segue into post-traumatic growth, actually. And so, if we were to consider from an existential perspective, then we might suggest that trauma has an effect, a negative effect on the presence of meaning and purpose in your life. And by that I mean that as trauma increases, the degree to which you understand or experience the presence of meaning is likely to decrease. I say likely because when you're working with people, certainly there's going to be a lot of variance, which is one thing I love about mental health. But we also understand that when trauma affects negatively the presence of meaning, so when trauma disrupts how you make sense of the world and where you fit in it and how it feels meaningful, we know that it also activates that will to meaning that we talked about. So one of those three core tenets of logotherapy. And so the will to meaning is exactly that. It begins this renewed search for meaning. And so there actually have been a couple of studies, this is important to know as we talk about post-traumatic growth here in a moment, that were done actually in the 70s. So it's actually been a little while since there have been a lot of real structured approaches to understanding meaning in respects to trauma. But essentially, that is exactly what they found, that there is a negative relationship between the presence of meaning and the search for meaning. And so really that's sort of a fancy way of just suggesting that when trauma disrupts what makes life feel meaningful, it activates our will to meaning, which is the process that begins reconstructing a sense of meaning in this world in the aftermath of trauma. And so that's what we refer to as post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth being the flip side of the post-traumatic stress coin. They are certainly distinct things. Oftentimes when we talk about mental health, we're actually not talking about mental health. We're talking about the presence of negative symptoms, symptoms of suffering in particular. However, with post-traumatic growth, we're not just talking about not having the symptoms of say, a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress. We're saying that you have additional symptoms that are actually positive that would not have occurred had that trauma not occurred. And in this case, we're talking about things in your life that may actually be greater than they were before the traumatic incident, which, again, should be codified. I mean, you're never fortunate to experience a trauma by any means. And there's not a trauma in this world that I think anyone would say that they were lucky to have or experience. But there can be outcomes of trauma that can then become positive, as well as predictors in and of themselves of wellness. Sorry.
No, and that's exactly, and like you were just going to say, and it is about predictors of how to, come out the other side. I think one thing you said is post-traumatic growth being the other side of the coin for post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic decline. But a veteran does not have to have experienced or be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder to achieve post-traumatic growth. It's not a one-for-one. You don't have to have the decline. You don't have to be down in the valley, for example, to gain strength, from an event. There's a post that I wrote, and I'll link to it in the show notes about getting through the other side of the valley of death. We whatever the metaphorical and sometimes, and especially for me, the very literal valley of death. That coming out the other side, we have a choice, if we're aware of that choice, to either engage in those dysfunctional behaviors that will cause us to continue to decline, or to consciously engage in those behaviors that will result in a greater understanding of mortality, greater appreciation of life and living, like we were talking about before.
Yeah, no question. I love that perspective, particularly in as much as we had talked about this idea of the life legacy helping to guide those exact kinds of decisions. And so when I talk about existentialism in the sort of capacity of mental health, that's exactly what I try and conceptualize, is this idea that you have some choices to be made, that every moment, Frankl talks about this in his book, every moment we're being asked by life, what is the meaning of this moment going to be, as opposed to us asking life, what is the meaning of my life in this moment? And those are exactly how we answer those types of questions, at least in the type of existential work that I practice, is by putting those first within the context of where we'd like to be.
Yes, and in that the choice, that deliberate choice, is also something that I understand from Frankl is very very critical. The statement, the famous statement, of course, we think of this when we think of cognitive behavioral therapy. I've heard this statement used in many different ways, but he said, between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. And in that statement, everybody says, okay, if I can just separate the trigger from my reaction, if I can get more time between that for when the loud noise happens or the smell comes, if I can get a space of time between that, then I can have more control over my physical reactions or my thoughts or things like that. And so that's very much cognitive behavioral therapy right there, is interrupting and being able to take back and question.
Yeah.
But a lot of people don't realize that that's really an existential concept, really a concept based on our own reflection of our existence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in many ways, I think the cognitive behavioral approaches are closely aligned, if not entirely enmeshed in existentialism. And so one interesting piece to the post-traumatic growth research is that it typically happens purely from a cognitive realm. So we talk about the transformational model of post-traumatic growth, which is the most common one that we use in the mental health field. We're talking about a model of understanding growth in the aftermath of trauma that looks first at schema change. And so what I'm hoping bringing existentialism does to this conversation is it infuses the idea that it's maybe not so much important as to the fact that you're thinking about your life in the aftermath of trauma that helps create or develop post-traumatic growth, but that you're thinking about existential issues specifically, and those end up being your predictors of whether or not you experience growth in the aftermath of something horrible.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and using that to really inform the understanding, that's critical.
Yeah.
I'm curious if maybe in your research, if you have seen maybe a difference between how veterans approach existentialism versus those who may never have served. Have you seen a difference?
I have not done a comparative study, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that, but I also haven't come across any comparative studies in the literature, so it doesn't mean that they don't exist. I've gone through quite a bit of the literature, but certainly by no means all of it. But it also might speak to an area of advocacy for us, right? That might be a perfect opportunity to engage in a causal comparative study. In fact, I might even add that to my research agenda because I have access to an undergrad population. I love it. Maybe you and I can do that together.
We might. We need to get done with this conversation first, and then well, the reason why I asked was a couple years ago. I had attended a talk with Irvin Yalom, who, as you well know, and as our readers, I've talked about both Yalom and Frankl a couple of times on this podcast. That Irvin Yalom had said that one of the things that he found most intriguing in his, now 60, 70 years of practicing psychologist is that most clients don't talk about death very easily. They don't talk about the end of life. There's a fear of the end of life. There is a lack of willingness to go there, say, in the therapeutic sense. And after I heard him say that, and I have immense amounts of respect for Dr. Yalom, and would never say that he's wrong, and I'm certain that he's in that. But in my experience, veterans talk about death all the time, right? That it really is that we're in, and I have this concept that as veterans are closer to, they've experienced definitely the military being an inherently dangerous occupation, separate from any trauma that might happen. But even as you said, when you were in boot camp or in school there, and even going through your 8 years, that you had Marines take their own lives, and we know that active duty suicides and veteran suicides are critical, and so death is very much a part of a veteran's experience in the military, theoretically, and in many times literally.
Yeah, well, most definitely. I mean, I remember very, very clearly having to dig fighting holes, and we called them our graves. So I remember walking around on Firewatch and looking at all of these Marines sleeping in their graves and thinking about the fact that we call them graves, right? You certainly cannot escape the military without deriving some degree of comfort with death and dying. It would seem to be.
Right, and that, in my experience, again, I think that is a difference in existentialism with service members versus those that haven't served, is that we're a little bit more aware of our own mortality. We're conscious of, I've heard veterans that talk about how, they thought they were invincible until, maybe they got injured, they saw a veteran, another brother or sister get hurt, or God forbid they saw him get killed. And so then it stopped becoming theoretical, and it became literal, and it became actual. And I've heard veterans talking about, angels of death, and not seeing angels of death, but just this really heavy, contemplation of death. What is the meaning of death? Why did I live and they didn't live? I mean, these are all heavy existential questions that can be challenging maybe to wrestle with on your own.
Oh, most definitely. I think that certainly contributes to why it can be really helpful to talk to a counselor. I think that the military may not do a great job all the time of making sure that you're aware of how beneficial it can be to talk to a counselor, but especially if you have the right counselor, you get in touch exactly with those kinds of issues. No question.
And you're right. I mean, we didn't do, and I guess I assume unless things have changed in the time that you and I have been out, that maybe not still don't do. But it's another colleague of mine, Tony Williams, had said on his show a while back, was that the military wants us to be very cognitive. They want us to be very rational and kind of reduce the emotion, take the emotion out of it. And sort of squeeze everything up into our head. I recall I had one of my gunners in Afghanistan. He had made a particularly challenging long distance shot. The enemy was acting in such a way that warranted it, and I was talking to him later. And I said, guy, that was a good shot, and just talking to him about it. And I said, how did you do that? He's like, Sarge, it was just like Call of Duty, right? And I just raised my weapon and I lobbed it, and I had to say, whoa. that was real life, right? Let's not think that, yes, there was this time that, yeah, it was all cool, but then pull back and say, no, that was something that was actually a real thing that you did, that you're going to have to come to terms with sooner rather than later. And I think that there's a lot of that, the dehumanization of the enemy and things like that, that go into a lot of those kind of things too. And I think, like you said, that the military doesn't do a very good job at doing that while they're in. And I don't know that they can. It's hard to change the machine when you're in the machine.
Right.
But then there's not a lot of resources to be able to help a veteran come to terms with that once they're out.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I was thinking as you were talking of another situation that I came across as a counselor where I had a client that was dealing with survivor guilt. He had lost a friend as a result of a VBIED, or a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. And one of the things that actually he had come up with all on his own. Again, I mean, that's in accordance with best practice when you're using these kinds of things in a mental health capacity. But he had talked about how one thing that had drastically changed the direction of his symptom development, if you will, maybe that's a good way of putting it, where he started seeing drastic changes in maybe his level of depression, even things like sleep disturbances, was this idea that if his comrade couldn't live a life that maybe his comrade wanted to live, that it would be in many ways disrespectful of that person to continue on the path that this client was headed down. Which was not a path that was in accordance with where that client wanted to be in that ultimate life purpose, that life legacy that we talked about earlier. So again, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Had he had opportunities to come across an awareness like that earlier on in his symptom trajectory, I think that would have been a really helpful thing. But it had been a couple of years, and a lot of things can happen in that amount of time. Most definitely.
So I hear you, and so you're veteran. I mean, and it really could have been any of the clients. I think I've heard that same kind of thing before, that they were in sort of a very unregulated emotional place. That there was a lot of guilt and shame. Mm-hmm. But then your client came to the realization that if I continue on this downward spiral, then that's going to be disrespectful to the memory of my fallen brother.
Yeah, exactly. And that would be never anything I would tell him, right?
Right.
But the fact that he came up with that on his own, yeah.
But there was also another piece that as as I was hearing you say that, a veteran could also say to themselves, because my buddy didn't get to live a life of happiness and joy, I also don't get to live a life of happiness and joy. And so could explain their downward spiral. And so I think that's a good example of where that's a divergence of, I'm going to decide to grow versus I'm going to decide to continue to decline, because it's how I explain it to myself.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? That's an area of the research that we're not real clear on when we talk about post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is still relatively new. I mean, it started coming about around the 90s, mid-90s, 95, 96. And so we don't know a lot about the development of post-traumatic growth or what specifically is contributing. I mean, we know that certain things help facilitate greater post-traumatic growth, like intentional rumination as opposed to avoidant rumination, or intentional coping, where you're trying to actively engage the experience and thinking of ways of assimilating it or accommodating it into your life narrative. Or there's the opposite, which is the avoidant, which is style, which is certainly consistent with everyone post-trauma early on, which is the idea that I don't want to think about those ideas or think about what happened. And so it slows or stunts that progression into making sense of it in a way that looks like post-traumatic growth. But that's exactly something we don't know a lot about, something that I'm excited to continue to explore, especially with veterans who have survived trauma.
And I think that's an important thing to consider is, where do we go from here? I mean, there is much in psychology that we don't know. Of course, there's much in the world that we don't know.
Yeah.
But this, again, is the reason why we're trying to provide this series to help veterans, help those that support veterans, and help other mental health professionals understand that there is more to veteran mental health, again, than just PTSD and TBI. And you mentioned survivor's guilt. survivor's guilt is totally separate from post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no guilt aspect, no shame aspect. That lies much more in the realm of what we're talking about here, purpose, meaning, and existential psychology, as well as tomorrow's show is actually going to be about moral injury, separate from, and there's a whole level of meaning making and how do I explain things to myself with moral injury. So a lot of these sort of converge, but they're also very separate.
Yeah, most definitely. I've definitely talked to a number of mental health professionals that when they want to talk to me, it's about things like post-traumatic stress. TBI is certainly one that we hit on occasion. But I've never had a mental health professional, aside from you, approach me and want to talk about post-traumatic growth. And so it's another reason why I really appreciate that you're doing these kinds of podcasts and that you're talking about things like moral injury. So I'm excited to hear that podcast as well when that one comes out. I'm a big fan of yours, Dwayne.
Well, I appreciate that, and really, again, a fan of yours because just when I was trying to research for guests who would come on to talk about this specifically, there aren't that many of our colleagues that are talking about this aspect of veteran mental health and how it impacts veterans specifically. The challenges, and again, the veterans are talking about it. I've got a good colleague, a good friend of mine, another former Marine who broke the mold. He was a platoon leader in Fallujah, and he went on to get his law degree. And so
wow.
He's a good friend of mine here in Colorado Springs. And Joe talked about that. I need to find something to replace the mission that I had in when I was in the military. I needed to find something that replaced that sense of a greater, and that is all about purpose and meaning. That has nothing to do with post-traumatic stress. You said that not a lot of providers, mental health professionals are talking about this. But I've been talking about this obviously over the last couple of weeks as we've been developing this series. I would say that probably about 10 or 15%, maybe 20% of the clients have some form that I work with have some form of post-traumatic stress. Maybe a smaller percentage PTSD, but there has not been a client that I've worked with, military service member or spouse, that hasn't had some struggles around purpose and meaning. It is almost universal when I talk to veterans as a mental health counselor.
Oh, well put. And I think when we think about things like addictions and how that is most definitely linked in most, if not every case, some type of trauma or complex ordering of trauma called compound trauma. We can also see that similar link with meaning and purpose, and like you said, just about everything that might make somebody want to talk to a counselor. Or maybe it's the opposite, where somebody comes in to talk about, say, trauma, or an addiction or homelessness or whatever, and they end up talking about meaning and purpose, and that ending up being a pretty core aspect of what effective treatment looks like for that client.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's these, we talk about peeling back of layers, and I have 2 teenagers, so when I talk about that, they talk about Shrek and onions and stuff like that. But it really is like that, like a layer cake, right? What Donkey says. But it is layers, and there's layers underneath. There's things that are foundational, and even and going back to Dr. Yalam, he said that I think in his book Gift of Therapy, he says that existentialism is not a separate branch of psychology. It should inform all aspects of psychology because it is so universal. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. I'm not sure why there has been sort of a hesitancy to talk more about existential things, but I think you probably hit the what's the saying? You hit the nail on the head when you talked about how there's oftentimes that hesitancy to bring in aspects of death and dying, maybe especially with sessions where that doesn't sort of organically emerge in the session. But at the same time, they are absolutely core indicators, or they can be core indicators of what wellness looks like for people, especially when it helps to guide each and every decision that we're making right now, which we know are going to be predictive in most cases of how we end up.
Yeah, this is great, Aaron. I think that you and I could go on for hours and hours, but I'd like to be able to give you an opportunity if a listener here wanted to learn little bit more about sort of existentialism, especially when it comes to veteran mental health. What kind of stuff would you recommend, maybe, that they check out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think right now I would stick with sort of the primary sources. So things like reading Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. If you're a mental health professional, The Doctor and the Soul as well is another great text of Frankl's. You'd mentioned a couple other really, really core sources, again, typically for mental health professionals, being things like Irvin Yalom's The Gift of Therapy was fantastic. There's a great book by Yalom called Staring at the Sun that can be helpful for clients, and I've given that out as a reading before with clients. And it's essentially a novel that he writes about death anxiety, about what it looks like to talk about death and about things in your life that can kind of bring those things up to the surface. So that was Staring at the Sun. That's a great resource.
Well, and we'll, I'll definitely make sure that there's a link to that stuff in the show notes. I believe, as a matter of fact, it might have been Staring at the Sun that Dr. Yalom was referencing in his talk that I had attended. But Dr. Yalom is very readable. He's very approachable as far as being able to read, and so I may throw some more of his some of his books in there as well. And again, just the idea of, as you did, you were seeking answers as you went through your experience and training, and you found Man's Search for Meaning, and it kind of drove some of that.
Yeah, most definitely. And I would say one last resource is a counselor. I mean, a counselor could be a really helpful I know that's sort of a general resource, but I thought I would throw that in there as well. Sometimes it helps hearing it from other veterans, myself, you, that counseling can be a really helpful thing. So don't let past experiences help to inform the potential utility of seeing a mental health professional, if that's helpful. No,
and I like that. And don't let someone else's past experience definitely drive what, because a lot of people say, and this is, and I've said it before, and I'll continue to say, and it's not like Freud on the couch. I have a goatee, I have glasses, but I'm not going to sit there. We're not going to talk about your mother unless your mother's the problem. Then we can talk about her all day. But it's not Freudian psychotherapy where we need to sit here and delve into every aspect of former trauma. That when you're in a place of less well function, you go to a professional to help you to get to better function. So if your car isn't working, you go to a mechanic. If your lungs aren't working, you go to a doctor. And so if we find ourselves sort of in a less than well place, or even a pretty good place, but maybe we're hitting a plateau, yes, of course, go see your friendly neighborhood mental health counselor.
Love it.
So how can some of the listeners maybe learn a little bit more about you? Do you have maybe social media, your own website?
Yeah, so I just got hired as an assistant professor at Western Washington University, so I do have a professional site that I can provide you that link to, and I can also provide my contact information if there are veterans who have interest in maybe even being a participant in some of our studies. Then most definitely everything we do is 100% anonymous and de-identified, so there wouldn't be any way for anyone to know who provided our responses. But we can find more information about studies that I'm working on, or maybe you're somebody who wants to help out with a study as a research assistant or whatever, or you just want to talk about existentialism, I'd love to do that. So I will provide you that contact information.
Yeah. So I'll make sure to get all that in the show notes. Well, Aaron, I really appreciate the time that you've taken today, and I think that you've definitely given our audience a different way of looking at veteran mental health and honestly veteran mental wellness. Well, I sure appreciate you having me on, Dwayne. Like I said, I'm a fan. Well, that's good. You, my wife, and my mom. So maybe that's. I know that there's some more out there, and really, as you said, this is. I think it's a necessary conversation. So thanks for joining us. Yeah. Oh, hey, no problem at all. Hard work. So I appreciate you listening to that episode with Dr. Aaron Smith talking about purpose and meaning in veteran mental health. You can find the show notes on this show and many of the things we talked about at either changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com, looking for episode HST032. This is the 8th episode of Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp, a series brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network and the Headspace and Timing Podcast.
Got to go make the call. Banging on the doors in the morning.
If you're a veteran or service member, the family member of one, or support veterans in any way, then this series is designed to help you understand more about veteran mental health.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you got to do it right. Hard work, and here we go.
If you're just now getting into the series, go back and check out episode HST025, where we introduce the concept of looking beyond PTSD and TBI in regards to veteran mental health.
Hard work, we're going on out. Hard work, we got to go and do the job. Hard work, load them up on the airplane. Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, hard work.
Make sure you subscribe to the Change Your POV Podcast Network on your podcast player of choice and sign up for updates at changeyourpov.com and veteranmentalhealth.com.
Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, gotta sit them on down. Hard work.
We would love to hear your feedback regarding this series and all of the shows in the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You can do so by visiting our Facebook group, leaving a comment, or review on iTunes.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, we're on the hard work.
Remember, veteran mental health and wellness is the basis of a successful post-military life, and one that all who answered our nation's call to serve deserves. Remember, brothers and sisters, you're not alone. Ever.
That's what I say.